that's a good position to ask. I mean, what does good look like, Helen? I mean, you've worked with so many organizations of different sizes and different industries, but
Yeah.
also on different part of in the different stage of their maturity. So,
Yeah, yeah.
describe what that good looks like.
I think there is a maturity scale for organisations with disability awareness and provisioning for disability. And whether you're a company, as Stav said, with 2,000 or with 80,000 employees, most companies have very similar challenges when it
Or a
comes
global
to
enterprise with 500,000, yeah.
yeah, or
Problem is
exactly.
complex, yeah.
Exactly. The problem is complex. And I think that what good looks like for organizations is having a single point of contact, a clearly defined route for people to obtain the support that they need. I think that route needs to be non-medicalized. I think it needs to be following the social model of disability, which, Britain as a country is really hot in. As we move into global territories, we're coming across more and more cultures, how different cultures interact with disability. But I think that having that easy route for support with as many barriers minimized as possible for the employee is critical. Not making line managers dependent, the employee has got to feel confident to come forward and disclose a disability. I mean, we know ourselves that even somebody with diagnosed dyslexia, it's often the average is 3 years before they disclose to their employer, so that stigma still does exist within organizations. I think that the IT side of it is massively important to get right. A lot of assistive technology involves IT departments making sure that certain products are compatible for their systems. We work through that with people. So when we engage with a new client, we kind of come with a whole box of tricks that and project plans, which enables us to work through all of their IT governance system procedures, make sure that there is a catalogue of products that assessors can recommend from, which is balanced for both the individual and the business. And that's massively important too. I think one of the challenges organisations have had up to now is that they just didn't know where to go. The government access to work scheme, although brilliant, for the funding, the kind of sweet spot for access to work is very much support workers and those kind of really high-end, expensive services, BSL interpreting and that kind of thing. Organisations should be able to manage the majority of workplace adjustments internally. I think one of the challenges with access to work, which is why employers find it difficult, is that the access to work will recommend things that aren't always compatible for the company's infrastructure. And then that means that the employees' expectations are raised and the organisation maybe fails to provide those kind of goods. So having a well-governed catalogue is really important for organisations. And I think good does include that. Also having senior support, executive level support, executive level sponsorship. I think that's massively important for an organization to be able to put these, from the top down right the way through a company. I'm also a pretty passionate believer, and we've done a lot of work about accessibility. And I think sometimes organizations make the mistake of, they will try and recruit people with disabilities, as a kind of something that feels good to them to do, and quite rightly so. However, unless they can support that individual when they are employed, then the recruitment of people with disabilities becomes a kind of moot point. You need to be able to support the individual once they're employed. And we've seen, sadly, a lot of cases where people have been offered a job and then they've not been able to get through the training because it's not accessible for a blind person, or the systems aren't accessible for the software. So there is a lot of work around getting a client to good.
It's not just the recruitment. It's actually onboarding, training, and retention all the way through.
It is, and sadly, 1 in 6 people fall out of work within a year of becoming disabled. And let's just make that conversation real. Disability, the majority of people become disabled through their working life. Only 17% of people will come into a company with a disability. We're talking about things like stroke, accident, cancer, the aging population. These are problems. I mean, Stav, there was a comment, isn't there, about we're all temporarily able-bodied. We're all going to be disabled at some point in our lives. And I think that needs to be the focus of organizations now.
If I was to take it one step further, only because that's something that really makes me tick at the moment, is the fact that we need to differentiate between an impairment and a disability. So there's people with impairment, so they have a visual impairment and dyslexia. A disability is something that is actually a byproduct in a way of the workplace. You know, a person with an impairment is not necessarily disabled in the true form of that word, just by sitting at home not doing something. You know, that function, the work function and being able to, you know, produce is where sometimes the disability comes into place. So it would be nice to create an environment where that impairment does not create a disability, you know, and we don't end up having to even record or report the disability, because the workstation in itself is accessible.
Yeah. I've said this to clients before, you know, maybe you want to go for a 0% disclosure on disability, because if no one needs to disclose, everything is completely accessible, you know, and that's the kind of
utopia. That's where we should be aiming, right?
But I also think that companies need to do this for their own customer bases. It's not just their employees. It's about how to, you know, the disabled, we're talking about 20 to 30% of the population.
And it's together. I'd say it goes together. You know, they say, I was reading the other day actually, that the scoring satisfaction, employee satisfaction scoring accounts for as much as half of the variance of client satisfaction. So if you want to be able to satisfy your clients, you know, and to serve your clients better, then you need to start with your employee base. And that will equate eventually to £1 million worth of money for its employee, you know, for its company.
So I would, from hearing both of you, the actual work of making the adjustment is not really the hardest part of this journey. It's probably 20% of the work is involved in the implementation, you know, the putting the adjustment. The 80% is everything else, like how you get the buy-in from line managers, how you get the colleagues to disclose, how you get the IT departments basically to approve certain products, or HR department to come up with policies on how to make those soft adjustments. So if you were a company starting on this journey, or somewhere in the middle of the journey, what's the advice in terms of what steps do they take so that they continue to improve? What goals should they be setting so that they know the measure against that they are achieving? Because I think it's not an overnight success.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. Many organizations we deal with start with surveying their population to try and get some feedback. I think one of the first steps that I take with any organization is to run a gap analysis. So I will work them through a series of scenarios, best way to say it, which can flush out the bottlenecks or the sticking points within each area of the organization. With workplace adjustments, an ownership is critical. So there really should be a process owner identified, somebody identified within the business that is accountable and can measure the success of those adjustments. I think that the measurement of successive adjustments is something that is sorely missed in a lot of organizations. So at Microlink, we kind of capture, as somebody goes through the process, we capture about 600 fields of information through the natural case journey. And what it enables us to do is to compare pre-adjustment and post-adjustment metrics. So we can actually tangibly see the return on investment for that organization, the increase in productivity, the improvement in relationships, the improvement with line managers. And I think that that's really important for organizations to measure the success of disability provisioning within their organization. We also run stakeholder workshops, because each stakeholder has got a really different lens on, you know, often the people in facilities or health and safety, they know what's going on the ground, you know, whereas sometimes the people in D&I and other areas, they're, you know, it's just area, they're places in the business that aren't normally linked, that don't normally have communication. So when we do stakeholder workshops, often it's the first time that anyone's met each other around the table within an organization, and it gives us a really good ability to start putting scenarios to them and working through how that process is going to fit in the organization. But it's also true to say that most organizations have something, whether that something is joined up in a holistic process or not, they will have something, you know, whether it's a supplier that supplies a certain item or an assessment provider. So what Microlink do is kind of fill in the gaps, and we, you know, chart that customer journey. And the customer journey is the really important thing about this. We chart that customer journey and kind of fill in those gaps with existing contractors. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, because companies, in my many years of dealing, working, and with employers, the leaders, as well as the disabled networks, I find that the intent is there, very strong. The people do want to make a difference. They do want to improve the colleague journey, colleague experience, because apart from everything else, apart from being the right thing to do and it's a legal requirement, it's good for business. So we know that. But what most companies fail to do is to measure how much progress they've made. And that's really what I think it would be a very simple exercise of listing down the stuff that are working at the moment, never mind the things are not working.
Yeah.
Because by focusing on the positive aspect of, yes, we have a process by which colleagues can ask for help without proving they're disabled, that's an amazing improvement to what it was 10 years ago. You know. But then once you've got those pieces that working together, then certainly just getting a friend to, I mean, when I say an expert friend, to come and review and say, well, actually, these are the areas where you could make those quick wins by making those linking of those two parts. That's how you could measure your own maturity. And that's important. We don't think companies out there are really totally failing their employees. We know there's a lot of good work is going on, but sometimes the effort is going towards filling the kind of gaps that shouldn't be there, instead of actually focusing on how to reach out to more of the colleagues.
And I think that the schemes that are available are great, you know, in the industry, disability confident and all of these types of schemes, but I think there needs to be more substance behind those, that accreditation, if you know what I mean. You know, we speak to a lot of companies which have got one area right, but not others. And Nasser, you touched on something really important. You know, getting an employee with a disability in assessment is actually the kind of easy bit about it. Getting that assessment implemented is the difficult bit.
Yeah.
You know, and the amount of people that I've spoken to that have sat there with products that they don't know how to use, that they've had for a year and a half, you know, we've spoken to a lot of them. So I think the implementation of adjustments is massively important.
I think what he also mentioned, what Nasser mentioned about the, you know, the data and reporting, for me is very, very important. You know, it needs to become, we've seen the results for other characteristics, you know, under the Equality Act, and the results that it had when it comes to measuring and reporting on, you know, on gender, on race. And I would like to see disability being next one, and that it becomes an agenda item in the corporate governance agenda of these companies. If you start reporting, it means you start looking. And if it becomes an item within their annual reporting, then hopefully it will start measuring. So I would expect that to be actually a starting point. You know, once you start looking, then you're engaging also with your employee forums, you know, your disability employee forums.
There is actually the cliche: if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So
can't improve it.
That data is, and let's start at the very beginning of the journey. How do you address this issue that some employers, I mean, you know, through no fault of themselves, because they've never really done this, saying that we don't really have many disabled people because nobody is disclosing. So how can we help? How can they can be helped to actually overcome that issue?
I think understanding the word disability is something that, Anna, I mean, how many times have we tried to think of a different word for the word disability? I mean, it has a set of predefined images behind it which people buy into, you know, and I think that's why I focus my master's, as Stav's doing, on non-visible disability. It is affecting 1 in 4, you know, people one way or the other. And I think that people like that, Nasser, they kind of get the understanding better when you start talking to them in terms of stroke, cancer, heart problems, stress. You know, you've got to find the right words to connect with people around disability. You know, it isn't just somebody in a wheelchair. It is a whole range of you know, impairments or health conditions which affect people. So I think you need to turn the language into less about, are you disabled? Tick this box for a reasonable adjustment, to, do you have anything, you know, along lines? Have you got any visual, hearing, you know, impairments? Have you got arthritis? Have you got migraines? Have you got? And I think that we need to normalize the language much more to
I absolutely agree. Sorry, that was one of my, like, words matter, and, you know, saying, using the word disability from a personal perspective, if, you know, I would say, you know, when for my daughter, when they say to me, does he have an impairment? Yes. Is he disabled? No, she is not disabled, you know. So it is very hard to, you know, words matter. We need to use the right words, and we need to ask the right questions to get the right answer. And positive representation as well within companies, I think, is very important. So yes, some of these schemes might not be as mature as we would like it, but actually having a positive representation for people with disabilities within corporates, within organizations, means that that person with the impairment is going to feel you know, easier to talk about it, to disclose it, to move forward. And if there is a channel, if there is a way to do it that is obvious, that is talked about from induction, from the day that they start work, before they even actually start work, then hopefully they will disclose that they have a need, you know, some for adjustments.
Actually, one thing came to mind along that line that you just mentioned. Many years ago, I actually attempted to find out how many disabled people we are employing, and it was an exercise, because I knew people like myself. I've lived with a visual impairment all my life, but I don't consider myself disabled. So as a trial of see whether that concept works, so I asked the employees in the company, and everyone knows how inclusive we are. We don't find that as a barrier. We think actually it's a strength. So the question went out, how many, you know, tick the box if you're have a disability. And the numbers came pretty much what we expect from most good companies, around 7-8%. Now, I know for a fact that's way below the numbers that represents our number. I would have thought it was more than 40-50%. Anyway, so what we did was our HR re-asked the question differently, listed 10-15 conditions which are considered as disability over a long time, and then said, which one of these conditions do you have, like diabetes, like visual impairment, hearing impairment, and there was a box in front of, does it impact your work significantly? And not surprisingly, nearly 30-35% ticked that box. So it shows, if you ask the question, framed it differently, you get a different response. Now, that the importance of that is if you have 50-60% of your employees have a condition which are currently regarded as disability, that's not relevant to you if it doesn't impact their work.
Exactly.
So what's the point of having a disclosure if that individual, let's say somebody who's an active football player and broke his knee when he was younger, and he's going to have that disability for the rest of his life, but he's doing an office job, never has to go in a cold storage area to work, he wouldn't actually feel disabled. All he says, I have a condition, but so what? And that is exactly what companies maybe sometimes overcomplicate in their life, saying, well, I need to have disclosure before I can do interventions. But no, actually, if you know people have conditions and it's impacting their work, then in a way you want to remove those barriers. So, Helen, over to you. I'm sure you've come across that all the time, because you do get people say that, you know, well, we haven't got many, or we do have too many. What should we do?
Yeah, and often, sadly, it ends up that a chronic problem brings them to us. And sometimes it's a bit too late to intervene, especially for, I think, some of the more pronounced cases that we've had in recent years have been for visually impaired people, people who are either blind or on that scale. And, you know, they've been recruited into companies because they are skilled, talented people. They're the right people for the job. And we've always said at Microlink, employ the right people for the job irrelevant of any disability. That's the way that organizations should be looking at things. However, it's heartbreaking when a blind person is recruited, and I can think of right off the top of my head seven times this has happened recently, where once they've been recruited, the assistive software then needs scripting to work with the systems, and we go through this massive journey for months to get that person up and running in work. I think that hiring managers should be trained on disability and adjustments, because somebody who becomes disabled doesn't go to assistive technology college when they're disabled. You know, they don't always know what they want. They're not suddenly imbued with the knowledge of all of the technology that's out there if they do have a disability. So, you know, when you've got a person who doesn't know what's out there and available for their disability, with a hiring manager that doesn't quite know what's out there available, or even if it'll work in an organization, then you've got a kind of recipe for disaster. And then the employee goes through a really uncomfortable journey, you know, which can have a really massive effect on self-esteem. I would like to see the industry concentrating more on retention and less on recruitment. I want the retention to be right. You know, I want companies to be able to keep hold of disabled talent and be able to work it through. I mean, and we've often said, NASA, that if you get things right for somebody with a disability, you've got things right for everyone, you know, because it's the hardest end of the spectrum to manage. So, and creating accessible systems and creating accessible ways for people to get jobs. I mean, I've worked with companies where they're really up for recruiting people with disabilities, but then their recruitment isn't accessible. Their policies aren't accessible. The way that people apply for jobs isn't accessible. And I think having accessibility at the core, I mean, we've done a lot of work with Dr. Neil Rogers, haven't we, who works for us, who's a real master in accessibility. And it is interesting to see the kind of things that he does with organizations to make their customer facing platforms and their internal processes more accessible. And, you know, I think that that's got to be on the agenda for companies massively now, especially in a more digital age where we're all working from home, we're all integrating with technology more and more and more, you know, but it's got to be accessible. How many people on this call always have captioning on, you know, for any of their calls? Probably not everybody, you know, so there are simple things that organizations can do and simple technologies that they can put in place that works for everybody.
Actually, a good point. I need to ask you both about working from home, all the legal challenges, all the practical, but the benefits as well. I mean, we find that people not having to travel, really a good number of disabled people find the traveling quite anxious.
Yeah.
However, working from home within their own comfortable environment, that could be the answer. But is that something, do you think the future is going to be, or do you think people are going to have the tendency to return back to work to the old ways?
No, I think that it's going to be hybrid. I think most of our customers are working towards a hybrid way of working, both at home and the office. But I'm going to put that with a big caution mark, because what I'm worried about happening, and many of our customers are in that space where they're thinking, do we duplicate adjustments at home and work? So if somebody is working, you know, 2 days in the office and 3 days at home, what do we do? Do we have the adjustments duplicated in both environments? Do we have them in one environment? Do we say to our disabled people that, oh, no, this is only available to you in office working, you don't have the option from home, or vice versa, you're only able to work from home rather than duplicate adjustments? And what worries me is that could put people with disabilities in a bit of a corner where, you know, working at home has got a lot of advantages, you know, lack of interruption, being able to go and get a cup of tea really easily. And, you know, it's also got some disadvantages. I think the average is that we're working 6 weeks in a month now, all of us, you know, whereas before, well, meetings were staggered, now they're one after each other, and it's pretty full on through the day. So working from home has got some really clear productivity advantages, but I wouldn't like to see a future where people with disabilities were not given the same options as people without disabilities where they work, you know.
Actually, on that matter, for the past 6 months, I was invited to attend a series of webinars to do with global inequalities through the COVID-19 time. And it was very interesting to hear from different countries as to how the lockdowns and COVID affected people with disabilities specifically, and brought up issues of inequality through the lockdowns. So like you said, I think it's got a bit of two sides to it. So yes, working from home is great for some people with disabilities because of the fact that you don't have to drive, you don't have to, you know, leave your house, so it's easier. You know, it brings down some of the stress, but actually it has a lot of anxiety.
Isolating, it can be isolating,
isolation, yeah. And the fact that you're not getting any feedback is, you know, not as easy, not as approachable. So there's two sides to it, and it's brought up actually for people with disabilities. Lockdown has not been as great as they initially thought it would be. Quite a few companies found it quite easy to, you know, the question that you've just put forward, oh my God, you know, how do we deal with this? You know, if someone is working from home, you know, the furloughed scheme, basically most of the people with disabilities, it was easier to just furlough them rather than try and deal with the working from home. But now this hybrid working is coming along. I think it needs to be addressed. And I think Microlink is actually quite good at looking at solutions that can even be transferred, you know, from the home office to the work office as well. And some stuff are quite easily done. We need to remember adjustments are not just physical adjustments, hardware.
No, there's soft adjustments.
There's soft adjustments as well that you can do. And they should still exist, even if someone is working from home. They shouldn't be taken away just because they're not in the office environment as such. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that the next few months is going to be really telling. Most of our clients are kind of, what they're trying to do is put in kind of pool chairs, specialist chairs in locations where people can go into the office and still get the support they need. But we're yet to find out how that's going to play. And obviously a lot of people who have a chair and then it gets adjusted to somebody else, and then they sit back in it, and it's, you know, you go through that kind of journey with people. But I just want that, what I really want is that the people with disabilities have the same choices, chances and options as the people without disabilities.
And do you get the sense and the feeling that over the past year, employers have tried to accommodate the disabled colleagues to be able to do their job as effectively as they can? Or has there been maybe even because of sympathy of saying, well, you're struggling, so we'll put you on full pay sick leave? And is there a danger we're going to leave disabled people behind when they're back to normal?
Yeah, I personally think that's a bit of a worry. I think that we don't want to be in a situation where it's easier for companies to isolate people with disabilities further than, you know, they already are. And I'm already starting to see some worrying trends in that direction, you know, where people aren't given the option, you know, whether they're working in the office or not. And quite frankly, somebody who's blind or has autism or any number of conditions walking into an open plan hot desk environment where they just don't know where they're going to be sitting from one day to the next, it is a real anxiety for people. People get really anxious about that. I think that it's going to be a problem. We'll just have to see how it pans out in the next few months.
Helen, it is already a problem. And it's not just a problem for people with disabilities in the workplace. I've read a report today, actually, that even for young people with special needs, that they've been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And so it's any person with disabilities, basically, whether it's in the workplace or in education. So the problem is kind of already there. So we kind of need to see how we can address it. And it needs to be addressed now that we're moving into a position of creating a more permanent workplace, a more permanent hybrid place.
Yeah, and actually the if there's any good points from the coronavirus, the kind of change in attitude towards home working is one. You know, NASA, I mean, even we at Microlink were not sure at the start, were we? And I think now you're getting twice as much out of all of us, aren't you?
Well, I think productivity certainly has gone up for a lot of people working from home, and that is a positive thing we should maintain, not at the cost of mental health and people really adding to their anxiety. So yeah, there is a lot of consideration, and we're not out of the woods yet. That the world hasn't got back to the old normal.
No.
And hopefully, but what matters is right now, how much are we doing to support the disabled colleagues working from home, away from the office, support them so that obviously they maintain the level of contribution.
Do you know, I think the other thing that we're seeing is a trend towards much more self-awareness and self-learning. So, you know, back conditions and musculoskeletal problems have always been one of the highest areas that Microlink deal with many organizations. And back condition can go from a minor niggle through to you're not able to move. It's a massive area of pain for people. So I don't like to say back condition, it's just a chair setup. You know, people have serious problems with their backs. But I think that self-management, so one of the most interesting things we've been looking at recently is a way that the camera is looking at the person and very discreetly, mind you, not like Big Brother, but actually adjusting their posture as they're sat. Because you can give somebody the most expensive chair in the world and they may not sit on it correctly. You can give somebody the most, you know, sit-stand desks to your heart's content, but they still won't stand correctly. So, you know, I think that there does have to be a little bit of emphasis on self-management and self-awareness and self-education. So I think a lot of companies are looking at that as a focus as well. You know, how do we get people into more of a preventative measure? You know, we've seen all the disasters where people have been using ironing boards as sit-stand desks.
Yeah.
The other day we dealt with somebody with a cardboard
company that was actually as well.
We had our first cardboard desk recently as well.
But they are actually, it shows resilience of people, and it's good to actually come up with solutions while, you know, during the crisis. But certainly for any employer who is going to rely on people having to do with those measures for long term, it's a false economy, because we know that it will cause a lot of injury and risk to the health and well-being of their employees. Indeed, there has been research showing 71% increase in number of people complaining about neck and shoulder and back injury. So this is really something not to be taken too lightly.
No. Also, I think companies are putting quite a lot of emphasis on mental health and PTSD and anxiety. You know, a lot of people are anxious about going back into the office. There's and that, especially with people with disabilities, I think we've spoken to a lot of people who are really anxious about the whole transition.
From Microlink's perspective, you know, this is obviously we're here for go-to people for a lot of our clients. So what are we doing to help ease that transition or help them navigate through this difficult period?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting involved a lot with the initial planning. So we're kind of getting involved a lot in many companies have taken this opportunity to redesign offices and refresh things in the office. So we've been working with a lot of organizations, because that's an area when you're talking about design of a building or design of an office that you really do need to get it right for people with all sorts of disabilities, not just mobility, but autism and all sorts of things. So we're trying to work with clients at a much earlier phase in that planning. So we can help them with building accessibility. We can help them with, you know, how to manage these hybrid working situations, ideas about how to have furniture in place for people to use in a hot desk environment, booking systems. So if somebody is going into an office, they can book a height adjustable desk and know where they're going to be sat for the day. That's really important to people as well. Collaboration spaces, they need to be accessible, you know. So I think getting the disability agenda right in the start of the planning phases is massively important for clients, you know, especially if they're redesigning offices and things like that.
Thank you, Helen. Anna, sorry, I've hijacked your show.
Anna, I forgot you were there.
I was leaving you to it because, you know, I've got my list of questions, but as usual, you know your topics, so you just carry on talking about what you know. And I'm really enjoying this, actually, and I hope that the people online and the attendees are enjoying it too, because there's lots and lots of very valuable information in this webinar. And I'm going to chop it all up and I'm going to use it out on there and social media afterwards, with your permission, of course, because there's lots of very valuable tips on where to start, on where you need to focus on, and you know, the aim for the future. I read a report from an article from Jenny Leigh-Flurry yesterday from Microsoft, who's accessibility manager for Microsoft. And she said that they were doing away with words like disabled, special needs, impaired. All these negative words are leaving the Microsoft language because at the end of the day, we're humans with needs. That's it.
Yeah, and all we need is the same as giving somebody a laptop to do their job. It's a tool, you know. That's giving people the right tools to do their job is how they should be looked upon, you know, whether it's a specialist bit of software, hardware, whatever. It's just a tool to do the job.
Yeah,
you know, we don't
wear glasses.
Well, yeah, exactly. We don't think twice about that.
Three of us have glasses here, and we don't think anything about a pair of glasses, and there's stigma attached to wearing glasses, is there?
The father of the social model, the guy that actually came up with it back in the 70s, a professor called Mike Oliver, for those of you that really want to go and look him up.
What's his name?
Michael Oliver. Mike
Oliver, okay.
Mm-hmm. He's the guy that came up. He had a disability himself, an impairment, I should say, himself. And he actually said nobody is born with a disability. People are born with impairments. So we can't remove that in many ways, but no one is born disabled. You know, disability is something that is, like I mentioned before, a byproduct of an environment. So Microsoft very well are basically moving to that next level that we all need to strive to be, which is the environment not making you disabled, you know, creating the workspace that will not present any issues with productivity. And you shouldn't have to mention if you have an impairment or not. It shouldn't matter, because disability, which is again something out there, is not attached only to people with impairments. So I am not disabled under the normal strands, you know, of what disability stands for legally, okay? But I am disabled in specific workplaces because of the way that I function as a human being, like you said. So we need to really move away of considering, oh, he's VI, he has an impairment, he has a disability, you know.
Well, Microsoft are really leading the way, and yeah. Last week we had Google, the chief accessibility officers from Google, and they have formed a think tank called Teach Access, which is where they've got Apple, Google, Microsoft, you name it, IBM, they've got the whole lot in there, and they're all looking at ways that they can improve education and teachers and access and all this right from start. And then, as NASA's always said, this will be an alignment, because if you fix it at the source, then it'll just...
Absolutely. And I think also, I mean, the one area we haven't spoken about, those kind of companies are influencers. Yes, you know, they're real influencers in the market. But what we need to do is make sure that message gets down to the SMEs, that message actually doesn't sit with the elite, that it permeates down through every organization, and culture and our community. And I think the one area that we haven't spoken about today, which we could rattle on for ages, couldn't we, Stav? Education, creating that cradle to grave approach, so people can go from school to school. I mean, Stav, you had an issue the other day, didn't you, with the school?
And it was a very simple issue. So trying to do it within 1 minute. My daughter is severely visually impaired. She's 7 years old. She sat in her class, and basically they hadn't put the blinds down. So as a result, she's photophobic. She can't see in the light. She couldn't see anything from the projector, even though she's up close and everything else. And because she hates disclosing, she hates talking about the fact, that, hi, I'm VI and stuff. What did she do as the normal 7-year-old? She eventually took her partner's maths and copied them so that nobody knows that she couldn't see what was on the board.
She's smart.
She's smart.
Well, she's definitely smarter than me when I was her age, because I just failed year after year because I couldn't see, but that didn't stop me going on to do the thing later on. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
It was a small thing. The blinds being put down would have solved the problem, and I had to get it out of her. So yeah, sometimes the adjustments are really economically, just opening your mind to it. Just one note on the teaching side of things. About 35 years ago, I spoke to a teacher as well. They had one seminar on SEN in order to become teachers on special needs, one seminar out of the whole training. The current SENCOs in schools, they can go for 2 years without actually completing any kind of SEN training. I would love to see an education system where actually teaching disabilities is part of the curriculum as a unit.
Teacher training.
For all teacher training.
And also in business studies when you get older. How I mean, Stav and I have both been on Warpath with our relevant masters, because it's not taught in business. There's nothing in the business agenda about disability and as it makes up such a massive amount of people, you would have thought that organizational development and manager training would encompass it in some way.
I mean, I was told I'm trying to write the disability, moving disability up the corporate governance agenda, and I had a professor actually tell me that because they're not going to be able to score me because there's nothing else out there, there's not going to be enough data for me to write it on. And I was like, well, isn't that enough of a reason why we should be doing it and bringing more light to it? So yeah, let's continue the conversation, basically.
So you wrap up. You're going to wrap up, Nas?
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation. Yeah. Okay, well, it is actually the top of the hour, so we have to thank all our guests for attending this webinar. We have another meet next week. Yep,
we've got Ali Knowles, and she is an emotional therapist. She's dyslexic and on the autistic spectrum, and she used to be in demolition, but as a whole, she trained as a therapist, and then she came across this new way of reaching disruptive, or what they call difficult children, because she was one herself, but she didn't know what was causing it. So dyslexia and autism was diagnosed later in her life. Anyway, she formed a school called, a company called Ollie and His Superpowers. And she goes into schools, and now she's a bit like Genius Within, she's got, 50, 60 coaches now that she's trained up. And they go into schools and they help with this emotional therapy, the kids who think that they're disruptive and, thick and don't like school. And actually I'm fascinated by it, and I can't wait for everyone on the show. She's just won the Global NLP Award, which shocked her completely. She said, I've never won anything in my life. So so she's on next week, Thursday, 24th at 2:00. I'm really looking forward to that. So I hope you all join us again for next week's show. And that's it. And thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you, NASA.
Thank you very much, everyone. And looking forward to seeing you in the future.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.